Looks like we got a great turnout again for the 15th annual conference. That is certainly one of the strengths of this association. So I appreciate everybody coming. I love coming to this conference. I know so many of you. I've gotten to know you over the years. It's been the highlight of my job, I think, is interacting with you folks. I know when I was a county sanitarian, I learned more from the inspections and interacting with contractors and things out in the field probably than anybody else. The classroom stuff is great for us who need to know the science behind the whole thing, but getting out there in the field is really where you learn some stuff. And I've had the privilege of working in 4 different counties, small counties and big counties, and a county in Illinois where things are pretty much run the same way as they are here, except they require soils analysis. So I was fortunate to work with a soil scientist over there and gain a lot of knowledge on that. Someday we may get there here in Iowa as well, but we got to have soil people in place before we could make that requirement. We have a couple counties on the east side of the state that use those Illinois guys because they're just across the river, but we'll continue to do perk tests and soil analysis, both or one or the other as we go through. I wanted to talk a little bit today about the contributions of this association and the progress that's been made in a relatively short period of time. Kind of compare and contrast that to the history of wastewater treatment. I love history. If you don't, I'm sorry. You're going to have to hear a little bit about history today. But it's the history of wastewater, so I think you'll find some of that interesting as well. That's a relatively short time period as well. So I think you'll find some of that interesting. This conference has always been one of the bigger conferences, I think, as far as state associations go around the country. You should be applauded for that. The IOWWA should be applauded for that. They usually put on a really good show. I should say always put on a really good show. So that is one of the strengths of this. Charles mentioned CIOWTS. I believe after I looked at the NEHA website one time that there's more of you guys that are CIOWTS certified in Iowa than any other state, I believe. That's an accomplishment. Training is excellent. We do have lots of training out there for you. Another big accomplishment of the association has been the habitat site. Not only is that a great humanitarian effort, it also provides a training platform where we get to use real wastewater as opposed to our training center, which of course we love, but we have to use clean water there. So that's been an excellent addition over just the past 15 years. The training classes and programs, those are excellent. We got our friends from Minnesota are here today, and they do some of that training. And so we have lots of training opportunities that we previously didn't have. Of course, the strength of the association is always with the membership. And that's you folks who come here. Very much appreciated. By coming here, to me, it signals that you are interested in furthering the on-site industry. And you can get CEUs at the same time. I'm sure that has a little bit something to do with it. We've made some strides at the department as well in our private sewage disposal program. A lot of this stuff was set in place or put in motion by Brent Parker, my predecessor, and then he left. But he did do a lot of this groundwork to start with. And I think as some of you folks that have been here, been with the association for a long time, know that Brent was a part of starting this association as well way back. Probably the biggest thing, of course, is time of transfer. How many time of transfer inspectors do we have out there? Oh, good. We got a whole bunch of them. I'll do a time of transfer specific presentation tomorrow. So if you're interested in the details, I would come to that. But that has made a lot of difference. I'll talk a little bit about statistics from time of transfer a little bit later. In the past 20 years, we've also instituted the general permit for discharging systems. There is some regulation that I'll talk about here a little later that does require that. We are one of the few states that do discharging systems. My last count was about 12 states have some sort of discharging system program. There are other states who spray effluent and stuff and don't call that discharging, but you know, they have a different environment where those places are. So the on-site loan program has been started in 2002, over 1,000 loans at this point, and $10 million worth of loans. So That's been a success. There's been a lot more loans going through this last year. I think we did nearly 200 loans. We were usually doing about 125. Time of transfer, I didn't think would have a lot of impact on the OSWAP loan program, but it really has. There's been an awful lot of people who have, as buyers, have bought a house, agreed to put in a system, and they're using the OSWAP program to do that. So I think last year we did 190. And our average before that was about 125, so it's a considerable growth there. We have a lot of room for growth in that program, and we are trying to make a legislative initiative this year. Next week the legislature comes back to take the language out that says you have to be in an unincorporated area. So that would open the loan program up for people that are inside city limits that currently cannot get a loan because the legislation that authorized OSWAP said you had to be outside city limits. My guess is those folks thought that everybody in city limits had sewer, or at least access to it, or they have access to SRF money where they can be hooked up to sewer. But as you guys all know, that is not the case. We have septic systems right in the middle of Des Moines here, as well as lots of other little towns, and the unsewered communities. So hopefully we can get that law changed, and we'll be able to give those folks loans. It's going to be a real good deal for some of the unsewered communities. I mentioned the unsewered communities. That was a project started by Brent Parker as well. We needed to inventory all the unsewered communities first before we know the scope of the problem, before we try to fix them. We were close to 600, and since we started that effort about 8 years ago, we have done about 80 towns, I think, have been either sewered with central sewer or sewered with all on-sites. I think the majority of the remaining 500 are going to be on-site solutions. So that's another opportunity for us here. As many of you know, we have a training center out at DMAC. We started working with that back in 2005, I think it was. And the association was part of it at that point. Along the ways, we kind of split ways and have gone down our own training paths for whatever reasons that are behind that. You know, competition's a good thing. And in a time when we didn't have trainings at all, just a short period ago, now we have lots of trainings. So there's plenty of obvious opportunities for you to get your CEUs. We've done 2 major rule changes since 1998. The last rule change was kind of minor. I'll just briefly talk about that a little bit. For all you guys that are time of transfer inspectors, you don't have to do an E. coli test anymore. When you do a discharging system and take a sample, we took that out. So all we do is a BOD and TSS. Don't confuse that with the NPDS permit. If you have an NPDS general permit 4, you still have to do all the testing, including the E. coli. That is the biggest thing that you're going to see changed. While if you look at the language, there's a lot of little things we changed in time of transfer. Most of it was adding language from the law, like the exemptions, into the administrative rule. The only other new thing for time of transfer inspectors is 10 business days to get your report to the county sanitarian. It's important the county sanitarian get that information as soon as possible, particularly if work needs to be done, because they're the ones who are going to make that decision. Otherwise, you're not going to see any changes in the way we do time of transfer inspections. As far as the other code changes, again, they're very minimal. We changed a little bit of language here and there, tried to make things consistent throughout. It says service provider in every location where it used to say service provider or certified technician. We used a bunch of different terms. So it's little things like that. So as far as the size of systems and those sorts of things, you're not going to see any change in Chapter 69. Chapter 68, for you guys that are pumpers, we made changes to Chapter 68, but it largely had to do with the on-farm food processing law that was passed. And if you want to know more about that, come to the pumper presentation that we have after the break, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. You were involved originally. Somebody passed a bill that took the septic pumpers' involvement out, so there really isn't a lot for you guys to worry about when it comes to on-farm food processing. So in a short period of time, we've come a long way. And everybody here has a part in that. So I appreciate the efforts you guys have made. It's kind of a team effort. We need the regulators, we need the installers, engineers, designers. It's a whole package. So it's great to see that group here. This conference is probably the best mix of those people of any conference by far. So it's great to see everybody here. Talks amongst yourselves, sometimes the best way to learn things. It's interesting, I found it interesting that this last 20 years or so somewhat parallels the history of wastewater treatment, which was really not a lot until about 150 years ago. And if you think about 150 years and all the time people have been around, it's a pretty short period of time there. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit. I thought some of you might find that interesting. I certainly do. Early pipes to the ditch. We all know about the pipe ditch, the ditch-matic, Brent called them. They go by a bunch of different names. But there was a time when cities all had essentially pipes to the ditch. This is a picture of a home in England that had a cesspool underneath it. And you guys run into cesspools too, I know. But they would have this directly underneath their house. And this is back in the 1800s, early 1800s, as much as up to 1850. And all their stuff would accumulate in that pit under the house. They built gigantic caverns under some of the major cities in Europe that would do the very same thing. And of course, the overflow is piped to the street, just like a pipe to the ditch. The interesting thing about this period of time was people didn't know, they had not discovered bacteria at this point. People didn't know what caused illness. Although they had an idea, people thought industrial activity and the pollutants that it put into the air are what made them sick. So at night, they would close all their windows and shutters as tightly as possible, when in fact, that was only making their situation worse because they were sick from the poop that was underneath their house. So that was night air, they called it. You got to close your shutters to keep the night air out. Then they hired a guy who was probably some of the first septic pumpers to come in there and clean that out on occasion, because they called it night soil. I'm not sure. Before electric lights, nighttime was a scary time for people when you really couldn't do anything because you didn't have any light. So I suspect that's part of the reasoning that they used the term night for these things. So they would pay a guy to go down there with a shovel and a bucket and clean out their cesspool below their house. And probably some of the first septic pumpers or close to that. God knows what they did with the stuff after that, but from what I've read, it was actually a pretty high-paying job too, which you would expect because it's a really lousy job. Talk about not going into a septic tank, huh? You got one that's the size of your basement. Somebody's going in there. It's amazing that most of those guys didn't perish. It wasn't until a guy named John Snow, and some of my sanitarian friends will know who I'm talking about there. He's kind of considered the father of environmental health, public health. He was the first one to make the connection between polluted water and disease. They had these pumps throughout London where people in a particular neighborhood would get their water, and there was really high incidence of cholera around some of these pumps. And they finally, at one point, he convinced the people to take the handle off the pump, the Broad Street pump, and the incidence of cholera fell dramatically. So it's kind of the first epidemiological study of what causes disease, which is obviously what epidemiology is. This was 10 years before Louis Pasteur even discovered that there was bacteria. There's these little bugs you can't see out there. So it was a pretty monumental move. What this caused, or at least partly caused, was more efforts to pipe things away from town. And that does actually reduce your illness in town. So in London and in Europe, they put in these gigantic septic tanks. They put in these gigantic caverns underneath Paris that would fill up with this waste. And of course, they would pipe the overflow to the river. So this did improve sanitation in the city, but obviously it wasn't really good for the waterways that they're dumping this stuff into. This is a 55,000-gallon septic tank in London. The caverns I mentioned that were under the city of Paris were multi-million gallon. And some of them are still there today. And they've cleaned them out, and I don't know if they use them for something or what. We talk about pipes to the ditch. My personal opinion, perhaps, that the Chicago River was the biggest pipe to the ditch ever in history, because Chicago dumped all their wastewater into the Chicago River for a long time. They also, which obviously discharges directly to Lake Michigan. That's where they got their drinking water. They have an intake out in Lake Michigan to get their drinking water, and they had to move it further and further out into the lake because they were polluting their own water with all the sewage that went down the Chicago River. They had some really high incidences of cholera and typhoid and that sort of thing in Chicago during this time period. So they knew they had this problem, so what'd they do about it? They built a ship canal, a sanitary and ship canal that took the wastewater to the Illinois River, which then dumps right into the Mississippi River, right north of St. Louis. You can imagine what St. Louis felt about that. They weren't really thrilled. They sued them in federal court, and before the case came to the Supreme Court, this canal was done already, although there was probably enough heat generated from that for Chicago to be one of the first cities in the 20s to start building treatment facilities before they did this. So they didn't have to worry anymore because the wastewater went toward the Mississippi and they could still draw their water out of Lake Michigan. So for a long time, all we had was primary treatment. I think I mentioned here a little bit later, Davenport, that's my home area. I grew up in Bettendorf. They had only primary treatment until the 60s, and they dumped the effluent into the Mississippi River at that point. It wasn't until the 60s when they finally built a treatment facility. So this is what they did at the time. They laid lots and lots of lines. They laid thousands of feet of line in New York, miles of lines all over the country, and discharged to the rivers. Didn't really help the waterways, obviously. Along came 1948, where they passed the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. It's kind of the precursor to the Clean Water Act. And this started some efforts to be able to put sewer systems in. Still at this point, we're talking about cities. We're talking about big discharges. It takes us a long time to get down to being concerned about individual septic systems, but it is in there. This also provided funding for sewers. A lot of the sewers that were put in for cities were put in the 50s, 60s, and 70s with a lot of grant money actually at the time. Those grants have gone away today, so these unsewered communities are finding themselves in a bind. Unless they're low income, they typically can't get grants, so they got to get all loans. So the sewer bills get pretty high in some cases. The burning rivers, I always mention that, although it really wasn't caused by septage or sewage. It was actually, they dumped everything in the river. Oil products, industrial waste, all kinds of things like that. And so you got all this oil in a river, it can easily catch fire. The Cuyahoga River, which runs through Cleveland, is the one that became famous, but there was actually river fires all over the Northeast United States and in Pennsylvania and Ohio throughout the 50s. The Cuyahoga River actually burned 6 times before Time magazine put this picture on their front cover and then finally got people's attention. It's garbage, it's oil, it's that sort of thing that is actually burning. I'm sure there's sewage in that water too, but as you guys well know, that doesn't burn very well. This obviously created a firestorm. You have to get people excited sometimes to make change. And this resulted in the formation of EPA and the passage of new regulations, including the Clean Water Act. That's why we do what we do with septic systems. It's why we regulate them. It's why we regulate wastewater treatment plants and so forth, because of the Clean Water Act. It was an expansion of the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. It authorized NPDES permits at the time, and it said that other sources of wastewater had to be treated with the best available technology. So by this point, we were already putting in drain fields and things in some locations. So we were a little bit ahead of the curve there. So as you can see, the progress was kind of slow. It's still things go painfully slow, as some of you well know. When you work in government, you have to accept that fact. It can be very frustrating. Some things seem so obvious that it's something you should do, but it's not always that easy to pass something. Or if there's somebody else who is opposed, you have to get everybody together. And I guess that's the beauty of our democracy, is everybody does get an opportunity to say something about a particular regulation. It does drag out. It took me 10 months to change the rules this last time, but it does give lots of opportunity for input. So when you complain about how slow things go, and I do that too, keep in mind that that is kind of built into the system in a way to make sure everybody has an opportunity there. Most of the progress in on-site's been since the 1950s, and there's always been a bit of a perception that on-site is low risk, and you can understand why. They're widely dispersed. So, but if you took the 300,000 homes we have in Iowa that are on septics and put them all in a city, people would get excited about that if it wasn't treated. It's a little harder to get excited about that one pipe. You've all heard that before. It's just my one pipe, or it's just water. How many times have we heard that? I like to go back to history for a little story about it's just my one pipe. Someone will tell you. When you go out there, you tell them they got to fix their system. Typhoid Mary was just one person. She was a cook in the Northeast in the early 1900s, and she refused to believe that she was making people sick. She's one of the first asymptomatic carriers of typhoid. She had no symptoms. So she didn't, I'm not sick. I couldn't possibly be making anybody else sick. She sickened at least 51 people that they recorded, and 4 of them died. She changed her name after they quarantined her, and they let her go. She changed her name so she could go back to working as a cook. And she made a whole bunch more people sick. And eventually they quarantined her for the rest of her life. Because all the time, she refused to believe that she was causing any sort of problem. We've all heard that before. It's just my one pipe. It can't possibly be making a difference. But you know, if that person's got some illness, they're shedding that virus or whatever it happens to be, and it's going into the waterway. And it very well could make someone sick. One of the standing jokes amongst the environmental health community, public health communities, you have to have dead bodies to get things done sometimes. And God, you got to really have something bad happen, it seems like, to get things passed sometimes. But that is the case. So we have made this progress, and in the wide scene of wastewater treatment as a whole, in about 150 years, 175 years, we've made the progress to where we are today. Obviously, we still have work to do. For the folks that are in that municipal, industrial area, they continue to look at what comes out of those pipes and where they're going and how that needs to be treated. But for us, there's a lot of work still to be done. And that was aided by the report to Congress by the EPA in 1999 that said on-site's here to stay. On-site will be part of our infrastructure for sewer forevermore, and it works, and there's nothing wrong with it, and it's not inferior to other types of treatment as long as you manage it. We got to have those systems managed. We can make them work a lot longer if they're managed, and theoretically we can make them work forever if they're managed correctly. So you go back to our unserved communities. We still have all these little towns, some of them probably ideal for all on-site systems. And we try to evaluate those as we go along and try to sewer some of those towns. That, in conjunction with the change in the OSWAP regulation, we hope will help get some more of the unsewered communities sewered. We have 500 of them. We do about 15 or 20 a year. So we're still looking at a long time to get everyone sewered. The same goes for on-site systems. There's still a lot of them that need to be fixed. By the time we're done fixing all of those, we're going to be going back to fix the old ones. So it's not like we're ever going to put ourselves out of work. But you all want, and I want, the best technology and the best system for the folks. Service is going to be a huge part of the on-site world. It already is. It's only going to grow. So I would encourage you to consider getting into service if that's something you're interested in, because I think we're going to see more and more of that as time goes by. So I put together some numbers that would kind of illustrate the efforts, what sort of effort has been made by you folks, everybody involved. You know, we got 300,000 houses in Iowa that are on septic systems. And we still estimate about a third of those have something wrong with their system, or they just don't have a system. If you put a pencil to paper and use some EPA averages for flows, that comes up to 52 million gallons a day, every day, that come from the on-site systems in Iowa. And the permitting of systems done by the counties has increased with time of transfer to about 7,500 systems a year. We were at about 6,000. And that's a considerable amount of wastewater that gets treated as well, 1.3 million gallons a day in just those 7,500 systems every year. Part of your other contribution, all those guys that raised their hand, you're part of this, and really everybody here is part of time of transfer. Time of transfer has had lots of side benefits, education being the biggest one. Everybody who has a septic system now and is even thinking about selling their house has had to think about their septic system, where before they never even thought about it. So that has been a giant side benefit of time of transfer. But you guys are the ones making this happen. You're doing the inspections. When systems need to be replaced, you're doing the replacements. We're educating homeowners along the way. So the program has worked really well. My best guess, because I still get a lot of paper reports, is we've done about 15,000 inspections, and about 5,000 new systems have been installed since 2009 when the program started as a result of time of transfer. We don't keep track of the systems that go in before someone has an inspection. So we're having more and more people, as the education level rises, realize that their system's not going to pass an inspection. And so they simply put one in before they put their house on the market. It wasn't until recently we had a way to try to track that, which systems are getting put in. They don't have to have a time of transfer inspection if they've got a new system that's 2 years old or less. So it would be great to have that number. It's a little harder to gather than the time of transfer report itself. Based on these inspection sheets that I get and some of the counties that have kept real close track of that, about a third of the systems that are getting inspected need some kind of repair, whether it be replacement or a baffle or a distribution box. I had a local contractor who does a ton of inspections tell me about 50% of the distribution boxes he digs up have had to be replaced, whether they be concrete or plastic, unfortunately. The concrete, you guys all know what happens to the concrete ones. They turn to dust. And the plastic ones, unfortunately, I don't know if it was a period of time that this happened, but the bottoms seem to break out. And I'm not clear whether that's a bedding issue or a plastic issue or what, but we're seeing a lot of them have the bottoms broke out. And you're not going to see that unless you pump the box out when you do the septic tank. You may not even notice it if it's got some sludge in the bottom of the box. I know replacing a distribution box, concrete one with a plastic one, can be a real hassle. One of the contractors suggested to me, or told me, that you can get a blank box from one of the distribution box manufacturers, which should probably make it easier, because you can drill your own holes, because the levels aren't always going to match up there. Just a little tip I'd heard from one contractor. So 5,000 new systems, that's 875,000 gallons a day that is being treated now that wasn't being treated before. And you folks deserve the credit for that. We have about 215 commercial septic tank cleaners, tank pumpers. We've had a handful of new ones since time of transfer came along, which has been great. They pumped in the 2010-2011 year 36 million gallons of septage. I was really surprised at that volume, but there's a lot of septage being pumped. 30 million gallons of that goes to treatment plants. and the other 6 million gallons is being land applied. And if you're a pumper, you know the trials and tribulations that come with both of those things, the cost with the treatment plant and the difficulty of land applying in some cases. But we're doing it, we're getting it done. This stuff's getting put out there on the ground in the proper manner, and that's a lot of septage, and it's been a great achievement of the folks that do that to make sure that much septage is managed properly. I have about roughly 120 sanitarians, environmental health specialists who do septic. We have some larger counties that have more than one person. They're permitting about 7,500 systems a year. A lot of them reported to me a 25% increase or so when the time of transfer came in. That's how we're getting some of those figures. They do countless inspections and homeowner education and those sorts of things. So everybody here is involved in this in some fashion. Here's a long list of everybody, and I probably left somebody out, and if I did, I'm sorry. Everybody's been involved in this, service providers, installers. Our rough estimate is that there's about 1,500 installers across the state. Now, granted, some of those guys do a half a dozen systems a year, but we've been keeping lists and keeping tally as we go along at the training center and have come up with that. Opportunity to get some of those guys in the association. So if you know some guys in your area that aren't, maybe it'd be particularly easier for the county folks to do that. Suggest they join the association. It's certainly some benefits to that. Engineers, designers, soil analysts, everybody involved deserves credit for that. The industry people, the tanks, we're seeing these 3-compartment tanks that are awesome. We're seeing innovation in the industry as well that makes the whole situation easier. We're trying to put things on small lots a lot more these days, it seems like, and those innovations are awesome, and they really help us be able to sewer little towns and little lots and that sort of thing, difficult sites. I talked a little bit about training centers and the 2 training sites. You know, if you think about it, 15 years ago, the only training available that I'm aware of, formal training, was a Kirkwood class. They had a class in the past that covered septic systems, and they had one for wells, and it was designed for county sanitarians. They haven't done that for a while, and you know, we don't need them anymore, nothing against Kirkwood, but we have, between the association and our training center, at least 20 trainings a year. So there's plenty of opportunities out there for you to train. Both the association and the training center do those all over the state, so you don't always have to drive to Des Moines. And that might be a good selling point to get other people to join the association. I think some of them think they got to come to the conference if they join the association to get CEUs, and that's not the case. We typically are having something pretty close to their backyard. The conferences are great. We have a great Iowa Environmental Health Association conference too that is primarily for the sanitarians. This conference, we have a lot more educational opportunities. We have a lot of national speakers. We have some here today. We have had numerous ones, and the association has along the way. It's great to hear from those folks. It's great to hear new ideas. There's been a lot of effort for homeowner education. I'm sure all you know that is an ongoing effort and something I don't think we'll ever be done with, but we will continue to try. We have the 2 different training sites, which both have their strengths, and everybody here deserves, and this association deserves credit for that. It's just great to be able to have this out there. I will do presentations as well for realtors and lawyers and bankers, the Bar Association. We went to their conference, all about time of transfer. So we've been out there a lot, trying to make sure that the time of transfer program stays uniform. So there's plenty of stuff out there. If you'd like to be involved in some of that, let us know, let the association know. Obviously, the folks love the hands-on stuff more than sitting and listening to somebody for 6 hours. But as you know, and it's a beautiful day today, but usually it really sucks when we have this conference. It's usually really cold and we've got a lot of snow or something like that. Well, that's why we have trainings this time of year, you know. Denny.
As a septic tank manufacturer, one of the biggest problems I run into, and I never heard you mention it once, and I don't want to insult anyone except face reality. The engineering community at Iowa State does not even offer a class in on-site systems, and I would hope that all of us could encourage you to possibly approach Iowa State and educate the engineering community, because I see it continually where they don't even have a clue about septic systems. They profess their brilliance, might be fine, but in practice, I see all kinds of problems from the engineering community just basically out of ignorance. And I think we as an association should unite to encourage the engineering community to get educated and practice all of these practices that we're all trying to do. And I invite you to try to do the same with them.
And I'm happy to say that we've had some better success in the last couple years even. Both of our trainings likely qualify for CEUs for a professional engineer license. So I've had 2 trainings now at DMAC that we had 6 DNR engineers come to one of them, which was fantastic. And I think we had another one that I didn't attend that had a considerable number of engineers at it as well. We do see some engineers at our trainings occasionally, but you know, it's going to be a hard pitch with Iowa State, Denny. Unfortunately, we're having some schools that had programs drop those classes. The University of Wisconsin, Jim Converse was telling me, dropped one of the classes that he had given on-site. So you are right, it is few and far between which universities are providing this. Minnesota does a great job, and there are a handful of others that do a great job. Most of the consortium, the training center groups, are universities that probably offer some kind of class. There's only about 20 or 25 of those. We had an advocate at Iowa State, Steve Jones, who had some interest in on-site. He retired, is somebody told me he had retired. So that's a tough nut to crack, but we will continue to work on that. And then we don't want to just pick on the engineers, obviously, and I know you weren't doing that either, Denny. But you know, we need everybody to come to trainings, obviously. So they do have a civil engineering program. Boy, if we could get them involved at some point, that would be great. But that's part of the reason that we're at DMAC, is because Iowa State didn't have any interest in it. We still got work to do, obviously. We always throw that 100,000 illegal systems thing out there. God, at some point I got to start using a smaller number, don't I? We still have 100,000 systems? What the hell are we all doing, right? Okay, now I'm going to put 90 to 100,000 because we've fixed some of them. But in maybe the 5,000 that we fixed, there's probably several thousand that developed problems in that time period too. So maybe that's not a really good measure to use. But we still figure that about a third of the systems need something. They need a whole new system. They need a distribution box. They need some kind of work done on those systems. We have these 500 little unsewered towns, which I'm guessing at least half of them are going to end up being sewered with on-site systems. So we have an opportunity there. I mentioned the service before. We're going to have an opportunity for more and more service, probably particularly in places like these little unsewered towns where they're going to have to use package treatment units because that's the only thing they can fit on the lot. Or they're going to have a cluster where they've got a pump that pumps to a system, which really needs management as well. So our department is pushing management, even if it's an on-site solution for an unsewered community. Because when they spend the money to put it in, which can be considerably less than putting the big pipe in a lagoon in which case they would be required to have a wastewater operator. If they're going to use on-site systems, that's great. We all know on-site systems work, but we sure would love to have somebody look after them. And so we're going to continue to push that with the Unsewered Community Project. Maybe some of you have heard about the disadvantaged community law that was passed. Essentially tells these little towns that we can't make them put something in they can't afford. So I think that's probably going to focus a little more of the decision-making on on-site systems, because on-site systems are more affordable, but the people need to know that there's maintenance that goes down the road with that. And sometimes putting in all on-site systems is a lot cheaper than a big pipe in a lagoon, but the ongoing cost is more, because let's face it, there isn't a lot of maintenance on a lagoon. So people need to know that going into it, and I do think that on-site will be a big part of unsewered communities. We've had a lot of that already, and there's some counties like Carroll and other counties that deserve credit for sewering many of their unsewered towns with on-site systems. New technologies are going to come along, particularly in the cases where we've got these small lots. That should be very helpful for us. New education, new information. Today, there's a really good list of classes. You can imagine, I've been to so many of these conferences, but today I see some things that I definitely want to see. We got some great presenters here today. So I thank you all for being here. And this is a good opportunity to go see some good education today. So let's go learn something.